Are you here to clean the place or did you get lost on your way to the senior center? My daughter-in-law asked loudly enough for everyone at the open house to hear. A few people glanced in my direction. One man looked down at the brochure in his hands. Another woman suddenly became very interested in the kitchen countertops. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word. But the silence felt heavier than any laughter could have. I simply smiled and adjusted the strap of my purse. 3 hours later, that moment would look very different. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 72 years old, a widow, and until that afternoon, I thought I had become immune to embarrassment. Life has a way of teaching you humility when you lose the person you love most. After my husband, Robert, passed away 5 years ago, I stopped caring about impressing anyone. I traded expensive dresses for comfortable sweaters. I stopped coloring my hair. I drove the same silver sedan I had owned for nearly a decade. I learned that peace mattered more than appearances. Apparently, not everyone agreed. The open house was being held in one of the newer neighborhoods outside Cedar Ridge, about 20 miles from where I lived. The listing had caught my attention online a few days earlier. It wasn't the largest house on the market, and it certainly wasn't the most expensive. But something about it spoke to me. Maybe it was the wraparound porch. Maybe it was the tall oak tree in the front yard. Or maybe it was because for the first time in years, I found myself imagining a future instead of remembering the past. The afternoon sun was warm as I walked up the stone pathway toward the front door. A real estate sign stood neatly beside the sidewalk. Fresh flowers decorated the entrance. Families wandered through the property carrying brochures and cups of coffee. Everything looked cheerful and hopeful. I liked that. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the natural light. Large windows overlooked the backyard. The hardwood floors gleamed. Somewhere nearby, a soft jazz playlist drifted through hidden speakers. It felt like a home where people could gather for Thanksgiving dinners and summer barbecues. A home where grandchildren might visit on weekends. A home where new memories could begin. I moved slowly from room to room, taking my time. The kitchen was beautiful. White cabinets. Granite countertops. A farmhouse sink. I ran my fingertips lightly along the edge of the island and smiled to myself. Robert would have loved this kitchen. He had always claimed he married me for my cooking. As I turned toward the dining area, I heard a familiar voice. Eleanor. I froze. There was no mistaking that voice. Vanessa. My daughter-in-law. I looked up and saw her standing beside my son, Ethan. Vanessa wore designer sunglasses pushed onto her head and a cream-colored jacket that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Ethan stood beside her holding a brochure. His expression suggested he was surprised to see me there. Vanessa's surprise lasted only a second. Then came the smile. Not a warm smile. Not even a polite one. The kind of smile that appears when someone thinks they've discovered a joke before anyone else. Well, she said, looking around dramatically, this is unexpected. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Mom, what are you doing here? It was a simple question, but something about the way he asked it made me feel like I needed permission to be there. Looking at the house, I replied calmly. Vanessa let out a short laugh. Seriously. Her eyes traveled from my sensible shoes to my old cardigan. I thought maybe you were helping the realtor set up refreshments. A few nearby visitors glanced toward us. Ethan stared at the floor. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the brochure. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough for me. Vanessa continued smiling as though she had said something clever. I mean, no offense, Eleanor. Houses in this neighborhood aren't exactly cheap. I looked directly at her. Then I smiled. No, I said quietly. They aren't. I held Vanessa's gaze for a moment, then looked away and continued toward the back patio as if her comment had not affected me. The truth was, I had spent enough years learning that some people reveal more about themselves in a single careless remark than they do in a decade of polite conversation. The backyard stretched farther than I had expected. A white fence framed the property, and beyond it stood a row of mature maple trees whose leaves moved gently in the afternoon breeze. I could almost picture myself sitting there with a cup of coffee on a cool autumn morning. For the first time in years, the image felt comforting rather than painful. After Robert died, people assumed my life had become smaller. In some ways it had. The house felt quieter. The holidays felt shorter. The evenings seemed longer. But grief had also taught me something valuable. It taught me that being alone and being helpless were not the same thing. I slowly walked through the patio doors and back into the kitchen. The realtor, Claire Donovan, was speaking with another couple near the island. She smiled warmly when she saw me. "What do you think so far?" she asked. "It feels like a home," I said honestly. Claire nodded. "That is exactly what I thought when I first listed it." Before I could say anything else, Vanessa appeared beside us. "Claire has been telling us all about the property," she said brightly. "We are very interested." Claire handed her a brochure. "It has certainly attracted a lot of attention." Vanessa glanced toward me. "Some visitors are more serious than others." Claire's smile faded slightly. She seemed uncomfortable, though too professional to comment. Ethan finally stepped forward. "Mom, are you really thinking about moving?" he asked. I looked at my son carefully. There had been a time when he could not wait to tell me every detail of his day. There had been a time when he valued my opinion. Somewhere along the way, our conversations had become shorter and more cautious. "I am considering it," I said. "Why?" The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, but because he sounded genuinely confused. As if the possibility of me wanting something new had never crossed his mind. "Because people are allowed to start over, Ethan." He looked away. Vanessa laughed softly. "Start over? Eleanor, this house is listed for nearly $800,000. Her voice carried farther than she probably intended. A few nearby visitors glanced in our direction again. "That is a lot of money." "Yes," I said. "It is." She folded her arms. "I am just being realistic." I smiled politely. Realism is usually a good thing. The conversation ended there, but the atmosphere changed. Vanessa had expected embarrassment. She had expected excuses. Instead, she found neither. For the next 20 minutes, I continued exploring the house. Upstairs, I discovered a reading nook overlooking the front yard. One bedroom had large windows facing west, perfect for watching sunsets. Another room could easily become an office. Each space felt more inviting than the last. Yet as much as I admired the house, my thoughts kept returning to Vanessa's expression. Not the laughter itself, the certainty behind it. She had already decided who I was. She had already placed me into a category in her mind. Too old, too ordinary, too limited. People often mistake simplicity for weakness. They see comfortable clothes and an older car and assume they understand the entire story. By the time I returned downstairs, the crowd had grown larger. Families moved through the hallways. Children peeked into closets. Conversations filled the rooms. I noticed Claire speaking quietly with another agent near the front door. Then I looked once more at the kitchen. The sunlight pouring through the windows, the polished countertops, the warmth of the space. Something settled inside me at that moment. Not anger. Not pride. Certainty. I knew exactly what I wanted. And for the first time that afternoon, I stopped wondering whether the house would become mine and started thinking about how soon. I remained at the open house for another half hour, but my decision had already been made. The house felt right in a way that was difficult to explain. Some places simply speak to you. Not through words but through a feeling. As I stood near the living room window watching sunlight stretch across the hardwood floor, I could almost hear Robert's voice teasing me for falling in love with the property before checking all the practical details. He had always been the cautious one. I had always been the dreamer. Together we balanced each other. For a moment I allowed myself to smile at the memory. Then I noticed Ethan watching me from across the room. He looked uneasy. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just uncomfortable. The expression reminded me of countless family gatherings over the past few years. Times when Vanessa made a sharp comment and Ethan chose silence. Times when I told myself he was trying to keep the peace. Times when I convinced myself that saying nothing was different from agreeing. The older I became, the more I realized silence has a way of speaking for itself. Ethan finally approached me while Vanessa was busy speaking with another couple. "Mom," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." He glanced around before lowering his voice. "Are you serious about buying this place?" I looked at him carefully. "Why does that surprise you?" He hesitated. "It is just a big decision. Most important decisions are." He shifted his weight awkwardly. Vanessa and I have been looking for something similar. There it was. The real concern. Not whether I could afford the house. Not whether I would be happy there. The possibility that I might want the same thing they wanted. I nodded slowly. Then it sounds like we both have good taste. His mouth opened slightly, as if he expected a different answer. Before he could respond, Vanessa appeared beside him again. There you are, she said. Claire just told us there are already several interested buyers. She looked directly at me. Things move quickly in this market. That is usually what happens when people find something valuable, I replied. Her smile tightened. For the first time all afternoon, I sensed a small crack in her confidence. Perhaps she was beginning to realize I was not leaving. Perhaps she was wondering why I seemed so calm. The conversation ended when another group entered the room. I quietly excused myself and walked toward the front door. Claire noticed me preparing to leave and hurried over. Thank you for coming, she said warmly. Did you have any questions? I glanced back toward the kitchen, where Vanessa was laughing with a cluster of visitors. Then I looked at Claire. Actually, I do. Her expression brightened immediately. We stepped onto the front porch, where the afternoon air felt cooler. The sounds of conversation faded behind us. I would like to know exactly what the sellers are looking for, I said. Claire studied me for a moment. Professional experience had probably taught her how to recognize serious buyers. Whatever she saw in my face seemed to answer her question. Her posture changed. Her tone became more focused. I think we should talk, she said. I smiled. I think so too. As the front door closed behind us, I caught one final glimpse of Vanessa through the glass. She was still smiling. Still confident. Still certain she understood the situation. She had no idea that the most important conversation of the day was only beginning. Claire led me toward a quiet corner of the front porch where a small table overlooked the neighborhood. From there I could see families walking their dogs, children riding bicycles, and the long line of maple trees that bordered the street. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted stability. The kind of place Robert and I would have loved. Claire opened a folder and reviewed several pages before looking up. The sellers are motivated, she said. They have already relocated to Arizona, and they would prefer a clean transaction. I nodded. No complicated contingencies? The fewer the better. Her answer was immediate. I appreciated that. Direct people always made life easier. Claire studied me carefully. May I ask something? Of course. Are you planning to finance? I almost smiled. The question was reasonable. After all, she knew very little about me. To most people, I probably looked like a retired widow living on a modest budget. There was a time when that assumption bothered me. Not anymore. I had learned that people often reveal their priorities by what they notice and what they ignore. Some notice designer labels. Others notice character. Some notice expensive cars. Others notice discipline. No, I said calmly. I am not planning to finance. Claire blinked once. Then twice. I see. Her professional expression remained intact, but I could tell she was surprised. I would like to submit a strong offer. She closed the folder slowly. How? Strong. The afternoon breeze lifted a few strands of silver hair from my forehead. I tucked them behind my ear and looked back toward the house. Through the large front window, I could still see Ethan and Vanessa moving from room to room. Vanessa seemed especially animated now. She gestured enthusiastically as she spoke. Perhaps she was already imagining where her furniture would go. Perhaps she had already decided the house belonged to her. It was remarkable how quickly people become attached to things they do not yet own. Strong enough to eliminate uncertainty, I replied. Claire stared at me for a moment before giving a small nod. Understood. We spent the next 15 minutes discussing details. Purchase terms. Timing. Seller preferences. Possession dates. The conversation felt surprisingly comfortable. Practical decisions always had a way of calming me. Emotions create noise. Facts create clarity. When we finished, Claire carefully organized her paperwork. I believe the sellers would take your offer very seriously. Good. Would you like me to contact them immediately? Yes. She reached for her phone without hesitation. As she stepped away to make the call, I sat quietly and watched the neighborhood. My thoughts drifted back to the years after Robert passed away. Friends often assumed I was lonely because I lived alone. What they never understood was that solitude gave me time. Time to think. Time to learn. Time to manage the investments Robert and I had built together over 4 decades. We had never been flashy people. We did not chase status. We did not compete with neighbors. We saved. We planned. We stayed patient. Small decisions repeated consistently over many years create surprising results. Robert used to say wealth grows best when nobody is paying attention. Looking back now, I think he was right. The front door opened behind me. Laughter drifted onto the porch. Vanessa's voice carried farther than she probably realized. I did not catch every word, but I heard enough. I heard confidence. I heard certainty. I heard someone completely convinced she understood the entire story. A few minutes later, Claire returned. Her expression had changed. She sat down across from me and lowered her voice. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "I think the sellers are going to be very interested in what you have proposed." I looked toward the house one more time. Then I smiled softly. For the first time all afternoon, the future felt very close. After leaving the open house, I drove home with the windows partially down and the late afternoon sun warming the dashboard. The entire drive felt strangely peaceful. Not because I knew what would happen next, but because I finally understood what I wanted. For years, I had made decisions based on what was practical, what was expected, what was safe. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself what would actually make me happy. That house had reminded me. When I arrived home, I set my purse on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea. Then I sat at the same wooden table where Robert and I had shared thousands of conversations over the years. The surface carried tiny marks and scratches that only I noticed. A lifetime of ordinary moments preserved in plain sight. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and waited. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Claire." I answered immediately. "Hello, Claire." Her voice sounded energized. "I just finished speaking with the sellers." I remained quiet. Sometimes silence encourages people to reveal more. "They were extremely interested in your offer," she continued. "In fact, they asked several questions about your timeline and financial documentation." "That sounds promising." "It is more than promising." I could hear papers moving in the background. "They specifically mentioned the simplicity of your proposal. No financing approval. No property sale contingency. No delays." I smiled faintly. Robert would have appreciated that. He always believed preparation creates opportunity. "What happens next?" I asked. "They are reviewing everything tonight." Claire paused. "Between us, I think you are in a very strong position." After we ended the call, I carried my tea to the living room and sat beside the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly as it had the day before. Lawns, mailboxes, familiar rooftops. Yet something inside me felt different. Hope has a quiet way of changing how the world appears. Around 6 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Ethan. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Eventually I answered. "Hello, Ethan." He hesitated. "Mom, are you busy?" "No." Another pause. "Vanessa and I wanted to ask you something." I already suspected where the conversation was headed. "Go ahead." "Did you really submit an offer?" The question hung in the air between us. Not angry, not accusatory, just surprised. "Yes," I said. Silence followed, long enough for me to picture the expression on his face. "You were serious." "I told you I was considering it." He exhaled slowly. "I guess I did not realize how serious you were." There was something almost sad about that statement. Not because he doubted me financially, because he had stopped seeing me as someone capable of making bold decisions. "People can surprise you, Ethan." "I suppose they can." Before either of us said anything else, I heard Vanessa's voice in the background. Muffled, impatient, asking questions. Ethan lowered his voice. "We really like that house." I looked around my quiet living room, at the framed photographs, at the life Robert and I had built, at everything that had taught me patience. "So do I," I said gently. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. The conversation confirmed what I had already suspected. Vanessa never expected competition from me. Ethan never expected confidence from me. They had already written the story in their minds. The problem was that reality rarely follows someone else's script. Later that evening, as darkness settled outside, my phone lit up once more. A new message from Claire appeared on the screen. I opened it and felt my heartbeat slow into a calm, steady rhythm. The sellers wanted to meet first thing in the morning, and that was usually a very good sign. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of birds outside my kitchen window. I made coffee and stood by the sink watching the sky slowly brighten. There was something calming about ordinary routines on important days. They remind you that life continues moving forward no matter what happens. At 8:15 Claire called. Her voice carried a level of excitement she had been carefully controlling the day before. "Good morning, Eleanor." "Good morning, Claire. I spoke with the sellers first thing this morning. I waited. They loved the simplicity of your offer." A small smile appeared on my face. "That is encouraging. There is more." Papers shuffled on her end of the line. "They have asked me to prepare the paperwork immediately." For a moment, I simply stood there holding my coffee cup. Not because I was shocked, because the reality of it finally settled in. The house that had felt like a distant possibility yesterday was suddenly becoming real. "Thank you, Claire. You are very welcome. There is one thing you should know." Her tone changed slightly. "Another interested party submitted paperwork late yesterday evening. I already knew who that was." "Ethan and Vanessa?" "Yes." I walked to the dining room and sat down slowly. "I thought so." Claire hesitated. "I hope this is not uncomfortable." "No," I said honestly. "It is simply life." She laughed softly. "Well, life seems to be working in your favor this morning." After we ended the call, I spent the next hour reviewing documents with my financial advisor. The process was straightforward. Numbers, signatures, verification. Nothing dramatic. Most important victories happen quietly. There are no cheering crowds. No dramatic music. Just preparation meeting opportunity at exactly the right moment. Around noon my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for several seconds before responding. Of course. He called almost immediately. "Mom." His voice sounded strained. "I heard the sellers are moving forward with another offer." "That is what I understand." Silence followed. "Was it yours?" There it was. The question he had been trying not to ask. "Yes." Another long pause. "I cannot believe it." I looked around the room Robert and I had shared for so many years. "Believe what?" "I guess I never realized." His voice faded. "Never realized what?" He sighed heavily. "How much you had planned for your future." The statement surprised me. Not because it was rude, because it was honest. Somewhere along the way, my son had stopped seeing me as a person with goals, dreams, and choices of my own. He had started seeing me only as his mother, a permanent fixture, someone whose life remained frozen while everyone else's moved forward. People do not stop living simply because they get older, Ethan. I know. But his voice suggested he was only beginning to understand. After the call ended, I gathered my things and prepared to meet Claire. As I picked up my purse, I noticed a framed photograph of Robert on the bookshelf. His smile looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. Steady, patient, confident. I touched the corner of the frame gently. Then I headed for the door. By the end of the day, several lives were going to look very different. Claire's office occupied the second floor of a brick building overlooking the town square. By the time I arrived, she already had several folders spread neatly across the conference table. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating stacks of paperwork that represented months, sometimes years of preparation by buyers hoping to secure the right property. As I took my seat, Claire offered a warm smile. "I have good news." I noticed the excitement in her eyes immediately. Real estate professionals spend enough time around uncertainty to recognize when something is finally settled. "The sellers accepted your offer," she said. For a few seconds I simply looked at the papers in front of me. The words felt real yet distant at the same time. Then I smiled. Not a dramatic smile. Not a triumphant one. Just quiet satisfaction. The kind that comes when patience finally pays off. Congratulations, Claire said. The house is yours. I signed the first document, then another. Each signature felt surprisingly ordinary. There were no fireworks, no grand announcements, just ink on paper and years of careful planning revealing their value. Halfway through the process, Claire's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted slightly. Everything all right? I asked. Yes, she replied. Carefully. It is just another inquiry about the property. She hesitated before adding, from Ethan and Vanessa's agent. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Some facts require no commentary. Claire returned her attention to the paperwork. By early afternoon, everything was complete. As we stood near the reception desk, she handed me a folder containing copies of the signed documents. I have to admit something, she said. When I first met you, I thought you seemed kind. I laughed softly. And now I think you are much more impressive than people realize. Her words stayed with me as I walked outside. Not because they praised me, because they reminded me how often people confuse quietness with weakness. Later that day, I received another call from Ethan. His voice sounded different this time. Less confused. More resigned. Mom. Hello, Ethan. It is true then. Yes. Silence lingered between us. Finally, he spoke again. Vanessa is upset. I looked out my living room window at the peaceful street beyond. I imagine she is. She thought the sellers would choose us. I considered my response carefully. Sometimes people become attached to outcomes before they happen. Ethan sighed. She keeps asking how you managed it. That question revealed more than he probably intended. Not how I chose the house. Not why I wanted it. How I managed it. As if the real surprise was never my decision. Only my ability. Your father and I spent a long time preparing for the future, I said quietly. Longer than most people realized. Another pause followed. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan laughed. Not bitterly. Not sarcastically. Just genuinely. Dad always did say nobody paid enough attention to you. I smiled. Your father said many smart things. After the call ended, I sat alone for a while thinking about that statement. Nobody paid enough attention. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps people only notice what was visible. The cardigan instead of the investment statements. The older sedan instead of decades of discipline. The widow instead of the woman. That evening, as the sun began to set, a message arrived from Claire. Closing preparations were already underway. Everything was moving faster than expected. I set the phone down and looked at the folder resting on my coffee table. For the first time since Robert passed away, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what came next. 3 weeks later, Claire called to tell me the keys were ready. The closing process had moved smoothly, and everything was officially complete. I drove to the property on a bright Thursday morning, arriving just before 10. The neighborhood looked exactly as I remembered it. The maple trees lined the street. The front porch welcomed visitors with quiet elegance. The house seemed less like a dream now and more like a promise fulfilled. Claire met me at the front door with a smile and a small envelope. Congratulations, Eleanor. She handed me the keys. For a moment I simply stared at them resting in my palm. Such ordinary objects. Yet they represented an entirely new chapter of my life. We stepped inside together. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the empty rooms. The house felt peaceful, full of possibility. After a brief tour, Claire excused herself to handle another appointment. I thanked her and spent the next hour walking slowly from room to room. I stood in the kitchen, sat in the reading nook upstairs, looked out at the backyard from the patio. Everywhere I turned, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude. Around noon my phone rang. Ethan. I considered letting it go to voicemail but answered anyway. Hello, Ethan. Mom, where are you? His voice sounded nervous. At the house. Silence followed. Then another voice appeared in the background. Vanessa. Even through the phone, I could hear the tension in her tone. Ethan spoke again. We are nearby. Could we stop by? I thought about it for a moment. If you would like. 20 minutes later, their SUV pulled into the driveway. I watched from the front porch as they stepped out. Ethan looked uncertain. Vanessa looked uncomfortable for perhaps the first time since I had known her. They walked toward the house together. Ethan spoke first. "It is beautiful." "Yes," I said. "It is." Vanessa glanced around the property before finally looking at me. The confidence she carried at the open house was gone. In its place was something closer to embarrassment. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I did not respond immediately. Some moments deserve a little silence. "For what?" I asked gently. She lowered her eyes. "For making assumptions." The breeze moved softly through the trees. Somewhere in the distance a lawnmower hummed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything felt different now. "We all make assumptions sometimes," I said. Vanessa nodded slowly. "I should not have spoken to you the way I did." Ethan looked relieved that the words had finally been said. I studied them both for a moment. Then I smiled. Not because I had won anything. Not because they had lost. But because carrying resentment is exhausting, and I had no interest in spending my future doing it. "The important thing," I said, "is learning from it." Vanessa swallowed hard and nodded. As we stood there together, I realized something unexpected. The house was never really the point. The point was respect. Respect for other people's experiences, other people's choices, other people's lives. Too often, people assume they understand someone simply because they know a few details about them. Age, appearance, circumstances. They mistake familiarity for understanding. After a while, Ethan and Vanessa left. I watched their vehicle disappear down the street before turning back toward the front door. The afternoon sun filled the entryway with warm golden light. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The house was quiet again. Peaceful. Mine. And for the first time in many years, I felt as though the future was waiting for me instead of the other way around. The weeks that followed passed more quickly than I expected. Movers came and went. Boxes were unpacked. Furniture found new places. Slowly, the house stopped feeling like a property and started feeling like a home. One Saturday morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched sunlight filter through the maple trees. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace that cannot be purchased with money because it comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. As I looked around, I thought about everything that had happened since that afternoon at the open house. The laughter, the assumptions, the awkward conversations. For a long time, I believed the story was about a house. But sitting there on my porch, I realized it was never really about real estate. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to let someone else decide your value. A few days later, Ethan called and invited me to dinner. It was the first invitation he had extended in a very long time without Vanessa organizing it. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt different. Not perfect. Not magically transformed. Just more honest. During dinner, Ethan asked questions about the house, the neighborhood, my plans for the future. Simple questions. Yet each one carried something that had been missing for years. Genuine interest. At one point, Vanessa looked across the table and said something I never expected to hear. "I think I forgot that you had a life before I met you." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then she continued, "I always saw you as Ethan's mother. I never really thought about everything you and Robert built together." There was no excuse in her voice. No attempt to justify her behavior. Just honesty. Sometimes honesty is enough. I nodded and took a sip of tea. "Most people are busy living their own lives," I said. "It happens." Vanessa smiled sadly. Still, I was wrong. The conversation moved on, but her words stayed with me. Not because they erased what happened. They did not. Some moments remain part of a story forever. But they reminded me that people can learn if they are willing to look beyond their assumptions. As months passed, my relationship with Ethan improved. We talked more often. He visited the house several times. Once, while standing on the back patio, he looked around and laughed. "Dad would have loved this place." I smiled. That was one of the first things I thought. We stood there quietly for a moment, both thinking about Robert. Then Ethan said something that surprised me. "I think he would be proud of you." The words settled into my heart with unexpected warmth. Not because I needed validation, but because I knew Robert would have said exactly the same thing. That evening, after Ethan left, I walked through the house one final time before bed. The reading nook upstairs. The kitchen filled with soft light. The backyard beyond the windows. Everything felt calm. Complete. I paused near the front door and glanced at my reflection in the glass. I looked older than I had a decade ago. My hair was silver. My face carried lines earned through years of living. But I also saw something else. Confidence. Not the loud kind that demands attention. The quiet kind that survives disappointment, loss, and misunderstanding. The kind that grows stronger each time life asks who you are and you answer for yourself. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs. The house settled softly around me. Outside, the maple trees swayed gently beneath the evening sky. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new memories, and new possibilities. And for the first time in many years, I welcomed all of them.